All right, I know we're all kind of starting our morning off here, but we got a tight schedule, so I do want to stay on time. Thank you all for coming out. My name is Ivan. I'm with ScaleFT. We've kind of taken the lead in building a community around BeyondCorp because we're so just inspired by what Google did. But really what we want to do is now take what Google did and make it applicable for companies of all sizes and all kinds. Because when you read the research papers from Google, it's a 7-year project that took a team of 100 people. It had executive support. It's not exactly the easiest thing for other companies to accomplish. So what we do as a community is really try to get practitioners who are responsible for infrastructure and security to kind of share ideas and share our thoughts on how do we take the outcomes of BeyondCorp and the architecture and actually build it for ourselves and make it easy and consumable. So at ScaleFT, where our office is next door, we've been working on kind of building access management products that are very inspired by BeyondCorp and trying to offer as much of it as a service. And so for RSA, we decided we would try something a little different. Instead of setting up a booth and jockeying for position, we would try to get people here in kind of a more casual environment, focusing on the practitioner angle, share ideas, share what we're working on, and see if we can all walk away with some better kind of guidance into our own, actual jobs. So with that, I'd like to introduce Evan Gilman. So Evan is from Sightail. Sightail is a startup here in San Francisco. Prior to Sightail, Evan was with PagerDuty and actually wrote the book on Zero Trust Networks for O'Reilly. And that was about a year ago when the book was published.
Almost a year ago.
Now, a year ago, not many people knew what Zero Trust was. Now you walk down the street and there are literally billboards and buses with Zero Trust, Zero Trust.
Pretty weird.
How does that feel to you as someone who wrote the book, and what do you think people, how has their perception of the model changed since then?
It's definitely a weird thing. I'm still trying to kind of wrap my head around that whole reality. Particularly when we started writing the book, it was a topic that very few people had kind of heard of or even been familiar with. Actually, I found a lot of resonance with folks in government. Working at Department of Defense, at MIT Lincoln Laboratory, and things like that. They kind of understood, but nobody had really put a name to it. People were just like, yeah, this is good security,
Right.
but without that name and without kind of, for lack of better words, this marketing awareness, people didn't really, it wasn't really something people were thinking about. They were just kind of blindly following this path that they've been following. So now to see kind of the book has launched and people are understanding it and some traction is starting to be there and we can see it in a really big way at RSA this year. Yeah. It feels really good that people are starting to think about this problem. It is the reason that wrote the book, was to kind of get people thinking about this and try and shift the tides towards something that truly feel will be better for the world, right? And so seeing all this kind of awareness and people kind of marching towards this what I hope to be the reality in the next few years feels really great. Of course, there's different perceptions on what exactly this future is going to look like, and certain people who were a few degrees removed have come 1 degree closer and said, all right, we're Zero Trust now, but
right.
Still might have a few more degrees to go. But even that, and even the acknowledgement that this is something that we should generally be doing is awesome.
Yeah, and even Forrester has kind of picked it back up. Yeah. They have a new analyst who's kind of taken the reins and really extending it out. They actually call it Zero Trust Extended now, which is kind of the ecosystem that's forming around the actual architecture. Nice. He does book signings. He's done it for us before. Great. And so now that you're at a new company, new position, new role, tell us a little bit about the Spiffy framework, that the T-shirt that you are wearing.
Yeah.
What is it? And what problem does it kind of solve?
Yeah, that's a great question. Spiffy, I think. Spiffy is kind of where Zero Trust was a year ago right now. People are still trying to understand, okay, how does this thing fit in? After I wrote the book, the book was very much meant to kind of, like I said, attempt to turn those tides and attempt to make people aware and attempt to try and move the needle globally on general security posture. Once the book was released, it was kind of took a step back and we're wait a second, there's a lot of hard work to be done here and there are no tools to do it with, and very few people have enough engineers nor the budget or hiring ability or anything like this in order to get any of this stuff done. And so it was kind of like a big disappointment, actually, in that regard. We've kind of just tossed a bunch of really hard work on people's laps and expected them to be able to understand and do it. And
Right.
so once that kind of realization set in, there was a big desire to say, like, okay, what can we actually do about this? What can I do to put things out there in the world that will enable people to build these systems in these ways? Assuming they want to, of course. I think most people are there already, but. So the SPIFFE project is essentially my effort, like on trying to make that a reality and for people to be able to use. So what SPIFFE is you can't really build zero trust without this like fundamental cornerstone of identity, right? All the stuff it deals very much on the bottom with authentication and identity, and then you layer access policy on top of that, and you layer a few other things on top of that. But this kind of fundamental piece at the bottom is this identity and authentication piece. Obviously, there's been a lot of work on this in the user realm for many, many years, but there has been like a vacuum of that kind of work in like the data center. Mm-hmm. So what SPIFFE is attempting to do is attempting to say, okay, we're going to make a standard for workload identity. This is how a workload represents this identity. This is how you prove that identity to another workload. And so the SPIFFE project is basically a set of specifications that says, here are these cryptographically verifiable documents. Here's how you can encode a SPIFFE identity into them, right? And here's how you can get one of those documents as a newly launched workload. There's another side of this, which is Spire, which is the software which kind of implements this stuff. It is a reference implementation of sorts. But SPIFFE is very much meant to kind of lay that foundational ground to say, okay, this is how you do workload identity, and now that you have this, you can go and you can do all these other fancy things on top. So it's definitely not the full picture of zero trust, and you definitely can't get zero trust just with SPIFFE. But I do feel that it's a really important kind of piece, and we're going to need it going forward. And if I didn't mention, it's all open source.
Yeah. No, I mean, that makes sense. I mean, one of the things that kind of led to the need for a new architecture in zero trust and BeyondCorp was kind of more of these distributed services. And it's not always humans. It's like these distributed microservices, and how do you make that attestation of trust? So now that developers are kind of building these, distributed microservices applications, what are the challenges that they face specifically? Not so much on the infrastructure side, but developers when you're actually trying to make an attestation of trust or some kind of identity for a workload. Like, how does that impact developers?
Oh, it's pretty bad stuff. I think that first of all, developers oftentimes see this kind of work as something that gets in their way. It can be very complicated. Security in general can be very complicated. It's hard for everyone to understand. It's and the way that things are now, it's very, very easy for a developer to make a single poor decision that will, completely undermine the security stance of the systems they're building. So the way I look at it is, that you're better off trying to remove as much of that responsibility as possible and take that off of the developer's plate. Let the developer build their application and build security systems in a way that kind of remove that responsibility and all the dangerous levers and knobs and things that can be turned, in the path of trying to get their thing to work, right?
Right.
Obviously, usability is a big thing there. So, SPIFFE tries to do everything it can to make sure that identity is readily available as easily as possible without having to know all these nuances and everything like that. Maybe you don't have to deal with like getting passwords from a secret management system because you can use an X509 certificate with your identity in it to do your authentication instead. And then we're providing like higher level libraries to try and lower those barrier to entries as much as possible. Proxies and things like this, like the SCO project is doing, also kind of fall into that realm.
Got it. Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, when you think of user identity, that's obviously tied to some kind of identity governance system. Pulling that information is how you kind of make a basic authentication decision. What kind of inputs or factors into kind of making a workload identity? How do you actually wrap that around?
That's a good question. I've since I've been working on SPIFFE over the last 6 or 8 months or something like that, I've been trying to come up with like analogies To explain to people. At PagerDuty, I used to think it was hard to explain to people what PagerDuty does, and now I find it's even more difficult to explain.
It wakes you up.
Yeah, that was easy. So I've been trying to kind of come up with these different ways to describe it, and the best way that I've found so far is actually comparing it to user identity. When you look at someone's driver's license, there's a picture of them, their height is there, their eye color is there, these kinds of things. We look at workload identity in a similar way, where we say, okay, what are the properties of this workload? And properties can be all different sorts of things. It can be a hash of the workload. It can be the user account it's running under. It can be the box it's running on. It can be the environment it's in. It can be a lot of things. So we look at all these properties, and the reference implementation is a great place to go check out if you're curious on exactly how to do this. But we look at all those properties, and all those properties together represent the identity. So in the reference implementation, you create an identity, and you say, okay, here's identity foo. Identity foo shall be issued to workloads with property X, Y, Z. And when a workload needs an identity that matches these properties, we issue that particular identity. Right?
Okay.
So very much the same as you go to the passport agency and your fingerprint, and you present other forms of ID and all these different ways to bootstrap. It's a similar methodology for
Got
workloads.
it. And then how is that identity authorized? So you've identified it as from an authentication perspective, but what would a bad actor look like from an authorization perspective, where you could say yes or no?
That's a good question. So the SPIFFE work and the Spire work, which is reference implementation, largely sets the authorization problem aside. When it comes to SPIFFE, we call authorization kind of out of scope for what we're focusing on. There are a lot of other projects out there that are focusing on authorization. OPA is one of them, the Open Policy Agent. But it's kind of hard to tell, right? So you might put contextual information in there, behavioral analysis, things like that, in order to make authorizations. Sure. Or they can just be very simple. Service A can talk to Service B. Right. But in terms of where that kind of thing comes into the SPIFFE realm is is it possible for a bad actor to obtain an identity that they shouldn't be obtaining? And so that's kind of where those properties are very important. It's very important to select the properties that are strong, that are very strongly associated with that particular workload in a way that they can't be kind of masqueraded. Sure. If that makes sense.
The cryptographically verifiable piece of identity is obviously very important. But what happens if somebody, uses that in an improper way? Obviously, there's some policy work and authorization stuff. There's obviously some more things to to be done in this world, and we deal with this a lot at ScaleFT on kind of the authorization engine. What are the inputs? How do we kind of define a policy, and then how do we make that decision? Those are, this is an ecosystem that's forming. I think we're all kind of working on
and that's
similar
a
goals
really
here.
critical piece of achieving zero trust. And it's unfortunate that we're not working on. I'm not working on that right now, but one step at a time. There are a lot of other smart people working on the problem too, and I'm hoping that we can see a convergence of these techs in the near future.
Absolutely. Speaking of a lot of people working on projects together, SPIFFE was recently accepted to the Cloud Native Computing Foundation.
Right.
How do you see that playing into the larger ecosystem?
That's a good question. You got lots of good questions today.
I wrote them down.
First of all, I think that it's important to have SPIFFE there for a number of reasons. I think SPIFFE being in a neutral place where it can't be jerked around by commercial interests is important. But also, I feel that, particularly with Cloud Native, the real strength of SPIFFE is being able to level the playing field in vastly heterogeneous environments. Going from on-prem or private cloud to public cloud, between public clouds, and all this kind of stuff is something where SPIFFE really shines, because it's not rooted in any of these provider-specific or environment-specific primitives, right?
Right.
So I think that in the context of Cloud Native Foundation, SPIFFE is a really important technology because it is able to kind of break down those barriers between, for instance, AWS and Google Cloud, right? Or migrating workloads between Google Cloud and my on-prem cloud. And to me, that's kind of one of the one of the prime directives of Cloud Native Compute Foundation is make it, number one, really, really easy to run cloud workloads. And number two, make them almost commoditized, right? Bring everything up one level. You see Kubernetes doing this. You see a lot of other cloud native projects doing this. So I feel that it's important to have Spiffy there, number one, because it's with projects that have similar goals. Number two, because it fills a gap that has been problematic, quite frankly, in the history of Cloud Native Compute Foundation. And number three, because I feel that Spiffy can live a successful life there, and like I said earlier, kind of be free of commercial influences and things like that. As the standard is really important to kind of have those qualities.
Yeah, I've been really impressed with how well the CNCF does governance. You've got a lot of projects involved, a lot of potentially competing forces, and they've done a really good job of keeping the governance open towards that goal of kind of this further abstraction across multiple clouds. And some of the things like the Istio Service Broker project kind of enable you to kind of plug and play a little easier. And so as that evolves, it's going to be great to see how Spiffy fits into that for what you guys are doing.
Yeah.
And then on the company side, tell us a little bit about how Sightail is now taking the Spiffy and kind of building around that.
So Sightail is still kind of work in progress.
Aren't we all?
Yeah, we're still kind of trying to figure out. We've got a lot of community help, thankfully, on Spiffy. We've got 150 people or so in the community that are actively working on Spiffy specification development. We have another community around Spire, which is that reference implementation, helping to build that, and there's a lot of Sightail kind of force behind that project, trying to get it off the ground, trying to get it production ready, all that kind of stuff. I think that at the end of the day, for Sightail, in order for Spire to be successful, any Sightail commercial endeavor has to lean on it quite heavily. If Spire is just a thing on the side, then it's questionable. It's questionable if it will succeed. It has to be production ready, and it has to have active users before we can say, okay, we breathe enough life into it so that it can go on its own. So this is like a pretty critical period right now. So Sightail is still trying to kind of figure out like product market fit, like exactly what direction we're going to go in. But it definitely seems to be that it will be services built on top of this Spiffy and Spire stuff that we've been doing openly.
Great. Well, it's important work you're doing. I definitely hope you keep it up.
Thank you.
And thank you again for joining us. We have probably 1 or 2 minutes for questions if anybody's got one. Where can they find more information on Spiffy? How about that?
There's a GitHub repo, several GitHub repos, Spiffy/Spiffy on GitHub. There's a great place to start. The specifications are there, and there's links to all of the special interest group calls we have regularly. SIG Spec meets once a week. SIG Components meets once every other week, I believe. There's also a Slack channel, which is a really great resource. The link to the Slack sign-up is on Spiffy GitHub repo. I hang out in there. A lot of us hang out in there. So if you have any questions, or you're trying to get Spire up and running, or trying to build Spiffy integration into your project, feel free to drop by and ask whatever.
Sweet. All right. Paul has a question.
As a developer, how do you think of things like Istio as an annotating proxy, essentially, or it's outside my code base and it adds magic, versus me like writing code to load the Spiffy cert myself, or other things like that. So I'm kind of curious, like, what do you think how as a developer should I consume this thing? Should I just be like, well, Istio deals with it? Or is it better to integrate kind of more natively?
That's a really good question. I think about this problem regularly. I don't think that it's super clear what the right way to do is. I think that the Istio approach, where this thing is basically glued onto your app and is separate, is really strong in that, hey, my developers, number one, don't have to know I can sneak it in under them. Number two, I don't have to change any of my app code. I don't have to rebuild things, which is really important, especially for larger enterprise, and they may not even have people who understand how to do this stuff. So I think the big strength on Istio is there. However, when you take this approach, there's a trade-off in that now the identity is not really with the application or the workload anymore. It's kind of with this thing you glued onto it. So how tightly is it glued on, and what does that gap between those two things look like? Right now under Istio, there's a bunch of IP tables magic, and some of it can be questionable. So personally, I like to see, I think that the right way to do it, in my opinion, is to build it into the workload. Now, the problem exists I was talking about earlier is the developer has to be aware of this. And so we kind of need to develop really, really easy to use, hard to screw up libraries that make that magic happen in the same way that Istio makes that magic happen, except in the app rather than glued onto it. So unfortunately, I don't, like I said, it's kind of what makes sense for your org. If you have the luxury to build it in, I think you should. But maybe not everyone has it. And adoption is certainly easier if you glue something on. If that answers your question.
Yeah. Nice.
Well,
Howard.
simple question. You said Cital, was that C-Y or S-Y?
SCY.
I have feelings about the name, but SCY.
Naming is hard. It's the hardest problem we all have.
Yeah, it's SCYTALE.
Yeah.
If you check out the Spiffy GitHub repo, there's a link to Cital at the bottom.
And then I'll share a bunch of links with everybody after we're done today. But yeah, Evan, thank you so much for taking the early morning session
Absolutely.
here.
Thank you for having me.
And hope you enjoy the rest of your day here at RSA.
I'll try my
All right.
best.
Thank you all. All right. Cheers.